The August sun beat down mercilessly on the streets of Elko, turning the asphalt into a sticky mess that clung to the soles of shoes. In this small town of 60,000 people, wedged between the desert hills of Nevada, news spread faster than a forest fire, and today the big news was the upcoming wedding of Pastor David Morgan. Detective Robert Hayes sat in his beat-up Ford across from New Hope Baptist Church and watched as workers set up white arches decorated with thousands of roses. 52 years of life and 25 years of police service had taught him to read people like open books, but Pastor David Morgan remained an enigma to him. "Another princess for our prince," Hayes muttered, taking a sip from his thermos, which had been trying to hide the smell of whiskey for the past 3 hours. The church door swung open and Pastor David Morgan appeared. At 45, he looked like a man nature had created to inspire trust. Tall, broad-shouldered, with thick chestnut hair streaked with the first signs of gray, his smile could melt ice, and his voice could convince a sinner to repent. It was that same voice that had explained to the police a year ago how his wife, Emma, had gone for an evening walk to the lake and never returned. Hayes remembered that day. It was a cold October evening when David Morgan showed up at the station with his eyes red from crying. "She didn't come home," he repeated. "Emma always comes home by 9. Always." The search lasted a week. The whole town joined in. All they found was Emma's blood-stained blouse on the shore of South Fork Lake and her sneakers in the reeds. The blood was identified as Mrs. Morgan's, but her body was never found. The case was officially classified as an accident, presumed drowning, but something about the story bothered Hayes. Perhaps it was because Emma Morgan didn't seem like the kind of woman who would go for a walk alone to the lake in the dark. The 42-year-old social worker for Child Protective Services was known for her caution and punctuality. Colleagues described her as someone who always thought ahead and planned every step. Or maybe it was because the pastor had moved on too quickly. Just 6 months after his wife disappeared, he started dating Samantha Clark, the 28-year-old daughter of William Clark, owner of First National Bank of Elko. Hayes watched as the pastor walked toward a white Cadillac parked next to the church. Even from a distance, it was clear that it was an expensive car, not something a clergyman could usually afford. The detective's phone vibrated. A message from the sheriff. "Rob, we need to talk, now." Hayes sighed and started the car. Sheriff Thomas Riley had been in charge in Elko for 15 years and didn't like it when his detectives dug too deep into cases that could damage the town's reputation, especially when those cases involved respected citizens like Pastor Morgan. The air conditioning was running full blast in the sheriff's office, but it did little to cool the heated atmosphere. Riley, a stocky man with a gray mustache, sat at his massive oak desk, poring over the Emma Morgan case file. "Rob, we need to talk about this case," he began without preamble. "It's been a year. No body, no new leads, no witnesses. It's time to close it." "Thomas, there are too many loose ends," Hayes said, taking out his notebook. "First, witnesses saw Emma in town that day until 6 in the evening. She was shopping. Talking to people seemed normal. Why would she go to the lake in the dark?" "People do strange things, Rob. Maybe she had problems we don't know about." "Second," Hayes continued, "her car was at home. How did she get to the lake? It's over an hour's walk. Maybe someone gave her a ride. Who? We questioned everyone. No one admitted to seeing her after 6 p.m. except her husband." Riley closed the folder and looked at the detective with a heavy gaze. "Listen, Rob, I know you're going through a tough time after what happened to Sarah, but you can't project your pain onto every case." The mention of his daughter made Hayes clench his fists. Sarah had died 3 years ago in a car accident when a drunk driver rammed into her car. She was only 17. "This has nothing to do with Sarah," Hayes said through clenched teeth. "It does, Rob, and we both know it. Pastor Morgan is a good man. He's helped many families in our town. His church does important work, and tomorrow is his wedding day. It's a big day for all of Elko." Hayes realized the conversation was over. In small towns like Elko, reputation meant more than the truth, especially when it came to people on whom the economic well-being of many families depended. Leaving the station, Hayes decided to stop by the city hospital. Dr. Eleanor Finch was one of the few people in town who treated him without prejudice. Perhaps she could shed some light on the medical aspects of the case. Elko Hospital was a modern 3-story building, built 10 years ago with federal grant money. Dr. Finch saw patients in the medical ward, but she also served as the town coroner. In a town of this size, one specialist often had to perform several functions. At 38, Eleanor Finch was one of the most educated women in Elko. She had graduated from Stanford Medical School, but had chosen to return to her hometown to help people who couldn't afford expensive treatment in the big cities. Tall, slender, with short brown hair and intelligent green eyes, she radiated competence and calm. But today, Hayes noticed something strange in her behavior. When he mentioned Emma Morgan's name, Dr. Finch tensed and her hands began to shake. "Eleanor, are you all right?" he asked. "Of course, just tired. Long day." She avoided his gaze. "What exactly did you want to know about Emma?" "You did the preliminary examination of her clothes when we found the items by the lake. Did anything seem strange to you?" Dr. Finch was silent for a long minute, as if considering her answer. "There was a significant amount of blood, but without a body, it's hard to say exactly what happened." "What do you think? An accident?" "I think—" She paused and looked out the window. "I think sometimes the truth is more complicated than it seems at first glance." It was a strange answer from someone who usually spoke directly and clearly. Hayes decided not to press her, but he made a mental note of her reaction. That evening, the detective sat in the Golden Cowboy Bar, one of the few places in Elko where you could have a drink and think in peace. The bar was on the outskirts of town and was rarely visited by respectable citizens like Pastor Morgan's churchgoers. At the next table, a group of construction workers were discussing tomorrow's wedding. "Did you hear the reception is at the Elko Hotel? 400 guests, live music, open bar," said one of them. "The Clarkeys spared no expense for their daughter," replied another. "Although I would have waited longer if I were them. A year isn't that long after his wife died." "Come on, Jim. A man needs a woman, especially a man like the pastor. He helps so many people, he deserves personal happiness." "Maybe so. But I always thought it was strange that they never found Emma. The lake isn't that deep. The current could have carried the body away, or animals." Hayes finished his whiskey and left the bar. It was already dark outside, and neon signs cast colorful reflections on the wet asphalt. The city was getting ready for bed, but tomorrow was a big holiday. The detective drove slowly through the deserted streets, past neat houses with trimmed lawns and white picket fences. Elko was a typical medium-sized American town, not too big to lose its human face, but big enough for dark deeds to happen. As he drove past the Morgan house on Maple Street, Hayes noticed that the lights were on. Tomorrow, this house would become the home of the new Mrs. Morgan. Samantha Clark would move into the rooms where another woman had lived a year ago. She would sleep in the same bed, cook in the same kitchen, sit in the same garden. I wonder how she feels about that. And does she know the whole truth about what happened to her predecessor? Saturday began with Samantha Clark waking up in a cold sweat from a nightmare that had been haunting her for several months. In her dream, she was standing in a white dress in front of an altar, but instead of David, there was a woman with long brown hair whispering, "He killed me." Samantha had never seen a photograph of Emma Morgan, but for some reason she was certain that it was her in her dream. The young woman got out of bed and went to the window of her childhood bedroom in the Clarks' mansion on Hill Street. Tomorrow, at this time, she would be Mrs. Morgan, living in a house on Maple Street. The thought both excited and frightened her. Samantha took a bottle of lorazepam from her bedside table, which Dr. Finch had prescribed for her 3 months ago. For pre-wedding stress, the doctor had explained at the time. But the stress did not go away, only intensified. Samantha was already taking 2 pills in the morning and 2 in the evening, although the instructions recommended no more than 1 per day. Going down to the kitchen, she found her father reading the morning paper, the Elko Daily Free Press. At 62, William Clark was still an imposing figure, tall, gray-haired, with the piercing blue eyes of a banker who knew how to evaluate people as assets in a portfolio. "Good morning, Princess," he said without looking up from the financial reports. "Ready for the big day?" "Dad, I wanted to ask you something." Samantha poured herself some coffee with trembling hands. "Did you know Emma well? David's first wife?" William Clark froze, holding the newspaper in front of his face. Then he slowly lowered it and looked at his daughter intently. "Why are you asking me this on the eve of your wedding?" "It's just that I'm going to be living in their house, sleeping in their bedroom. I think it's normal to want to know about her." Clark folded the newspaper and leaned back in his chair. Emma Morgan was a complicated woman, withdrawn. David often complained that she changed after a few years of marriage. Depressed, suspicious. Suspicious of what? "Sammy, it doesn't matter. She's dead. Your life with David is a new chapter. There's no point in digging up the past." But Samantha couldn't let the subject drop. "Dad, is it true that the case of her disappearance is still open?" Clark's face darkened. "Detective Hayes is too stubborn for his own good. Some cases are better left alone." "But what if she's alive? What if—" "Samantha!" her father interrupted sharply. "Enough of this nonsense! You're getting married in 2 days to a wonderful man who loves you. The church will be full of people who respect him. Don't ruin everything with your fantasies." After breakfast, Samantha decided to go to David's house to see how the preparations were going. She had a key. David had given it to her a month ago, saying, "This is your home now, sweetheart." The house on Maple Street was built in the 1960s in a classic American style. 2 stories, red brick, white columns, a neat lawn. Nothing fancy, but cozy and respectable. A pastor's house had to inspire confidence in the congregation. David was at the church, rehearsing the ceremony with clergy from neighboring towns who had come to help with the celebration. Samantha was left alone in the house that would become her home tomorrow. She slowly walked through the living room, looking at the photographs on the mantelpiece. Most of them were taken after Emma's disappearance. David with parishioners, with children from Sunday school, with city officials. But in the far corner, she noticed an old photograph in a silver frame. In the picture, David was standing next to a woman. She was tall and slender, with long brown hair and intelligent brown eyes. Samantha knew immediately that it was Emma. His first wife looked happy in the photo, but there was something forced about her smile, as if she were smiling through gritted teeth. "You were beautiful," Samantha said quietly, studying the face of her predecessor. "What happened to you?" Going up to the second floor, she entered the master bedroom. Everything had been redone after Emma's disappearance. New wallpaper, new furniture, new bedding. David had explained it as a desire to start with a clean slate. But Samantha sensed something intangible, as if the spirit of the previous owner still lingered within these walls. She opened the closet and saw that half of it was empty. "For your things," David had said. But then why was there a woman's dress hanging in the far corner behind the winter coats? It was dark blue, simple in style, size 42. Samantha took out the dress and examined it. There was a small stain on the collar. It looked like blood. Her hands trembled. It was Emma's dress, which David had not thrown away with the rest of his wife's things for some reason. The sound of the front door opening made her jump. She quickly hung the dress back up and went downstairs. "Sammy, are you here?" David's voice rang out. "Yes, dear. Just looking around the house." David Morgan climbed the stairs and hugged her. Even now, on the eve of their wedding, he looked impeccable. His shirt ironed, his hair neatly combed, smelling of fresh cologne. But Samantha noticed something new in his eyes, a tension that hadn't been there before. "How was the rehearsal?" she asked. "Everything's ready. Tomorrow will be a wonderful day." He hugged her tighter. "You won't regret marrying an old widower. You're not old, and I love you. And I love you more than life itself," he said, and something in his tone made her wary. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Dr. Eleanor Finch sat in her office at the hospital, trying to concentrate on medical charts. But her thoughts kept returning to yesterday's conversation with Detective Hayes. She took the key to the archive from her desk drawer and went down to the hospital basement. Here, among dusty files and boxes, were stored medical records from the last 10 years. Eleanor found the box she was looking for and took out a thick folder labeled Morgan, Emma Jane. Emma's medical history told a sad story. 3 years before her disappearance, she had begun visiting the doctor regularly. bruises on her arms. Fell down the stairs. A broken rib. Opened the car door incorrectly. Concussion. Slipped in the bathroom. Eleanor remembered every one of those visits. She remembered how Emma avoided her gaze, how she made up new explanations for her injuries. She remembered how she wanted to help, but Emma always refused her offers to talk to a psychologist or contact domestic violence services. The worst part was that Eleanor knew the truth, but she couldn't prove it. And now, a year later, she was about to destroy the only evidence that Emma Morgan had been the victim of systematic abuse. The doctor took out a lighter and set fire to the first page of the medical file. The paper burst into bright flames, reducing to ashes the records of the fractures, bruises, and tears of the woman she had been unable to save. "I'm sorry, Emma," she whispered as she watched the fire consume the last traces of the truth. Meanwhile, Detective Hayes sat in his car outside the Morgan house, watching the pastor and his fiancée talk in the living room. Even through the window, it was clear that the conversation was not pleasant. Samantha was gesticulating. David was trying to calm her down. Hayes took out his phone and dialed the number of an old friend from the Reno police. "Jack, it's Rob Hayes from Elko. I need a favor." "Hi, Rob. I'm listening. Can you run a check on David Morgan? 45 years old, Baptist minister. I'm particularly interested in anything that happened before he moved to Elko. Give me an hour." An hour later, Jack called back with some interesting information. "Rob, your pastor is an interesting character. Before Elko, he served at a church in Carson City. He was there for only 2 years and left under strange circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" "One of the parishioners filed a complaint of harassment. The case never went to court, but the church leadership asked him to leave. And before that, in Phoenix, there was a similar story. So our saintly pastor has a problem with women. It looks that way. And there's another detail. He also had a girlfriend in Carson City who mysteriously disappeared. Her name was Lisa Parker. The case was never solved." Hayes felt his pulse quicken. Perhaps Emma Morgan's disappearance was not an isolated incident. "Jack, can you send me all the files on this case?" "Sure, but Rob, be careful. If I'm right, your pastor could be a very dangerous man." After ending the call, Hayes decided to go to the Golden Cowboy Bar to think about the information he had received. But on the way, he noticed a familiar figure. Dr. Finch was leaving the hospital with a small box in her hands. The detective parked in an alley and watched as the doctor headed for the dumpsters behind the building. She opened the box and began throwing out some papers. Even from a distance, Hayes could see that they were medical records. When Eleanor left, he walked over to the dumpster and looked inside. Among the usual trash were the charred remains of medical documents. Most of them had been destroyed, but a few fragments remained. On one of them, he made out a name. Morgan, Emma. So Dr. Finch had destroyed Emma Morgan's medical records. But why? What was in them that needed to be destroyed? Hayes gathered everything he could find and drove home. In his small apartment, he laid the fragments out on the table, trying to piece them together. He managed to read a few dates and diagnoses. Contusion of the right shoulder, fracture of the third rib, mild concussion. The picture was becoming clearer. Emma Morgan was a victim of domestic violence, and Dr. Finch was destroying evidence that could prove it. But why? What was she afraid of? And most importantly, if Emma really was a victim of violence, what happened that night a year ago? Hayes opened a bottle of whiskey and poured himself a generous drink. Tomorrow would be a big day in Elko. The whole town would turn out to see their beloved pastor marry a beautiful girl from a good family. But the detective knew that beneath the mask of piety lay something dark and dangerous. He looked at the photo of Sarah on the nightstand. His daughter had died because he couldn't protect her from a drunk driver. But maybe he could still protect Samantha Clark from the monster she was marrying tomorrow. Hayes took out his phone and started dialing Sheriff Riley's number, but then he stopped. Riley wouldn't believe him without solid evidence. All he had were guesses and burnt scraps of paper. No, he needed more information, and he only had one night left. Sunday morning in Elko began with the ringing of bells at New Hope Church. In a few hours, an event that the whole town had been talking about for months would take place. But first, David Morgan had to conduct his last morning service as a bachelor. Detective Hayes sat in the back row among the congregation and watched the pastor. David looked impeccable, as always, but there was something about his demeanor that seemed forced. His smile was too wide, his laughter too loud, his gestures too energetic. "Brothers and sisters," the pastor said from the pulpit, "today is a special day, not only for me, but for our entire community. The Lord has sent me a second love when I thought my heart would remain broken forever after the tragic loss of my dear Emma." At the mention of his wife's name, several women in the front rows began to sob. Hayes noticed that Dr. Finch, sitting to his right, clenched her hands into fists. "Emma was an angel," David continued, his voice trembling with genuine emotion. "She taught me to love, to forgive, to be a better person. And although the Lord took her from us too soon, I know she is watching over us from heaven and blessing my union with the beautiful Samantha." After the service, Hayes followed Dr. Finch to the parking lot. She walked quickly, looking back nervously, as if afraid someone was following her. "Dr. Finch!" he called out. Eleanor stopped and slowly turned around. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes. "Detective Hayes, what do you want?" "To talk. About last night." "I don't know what you're talking about." "The medical records you burned behind the hospital. Emma Morgan's records." Eleanor froze, like a deer in the headlights. She was silent for a few seconds, then said quietly, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Doctor, I found the remains. Records of fractures, bruises, concussions. Emma was a victim of domestic violence, wasn't she?" Eleanor closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, they were filled with tears. "Even if that's true, she's dead. What difference does it make?" "A lot. If David killed her, Samantha is in danger." "You have no proof." "But you did. Or you did until you destroyed it." Dr. Finch looked at the church, where the voices of parishioners discussing the upcoming wedding could still be heard. "Detective, some things are better left in the past. Even if it could save a life?" Eleanor didn't answer. She got into her car and drove away, leaving Hayes with even more questions. Meanwhile, the Clark's mansion was bustling with pre-wedding preparations. Samantha sat in front of the mirror while the hairdresser and makeup artist got her ready for the ceremony. But the girl's thoughts were far from beauty and celebration. She had been up all night thinking about the dress she had found and her father's strange behavior. In the morning, while looking through the wedding gifts, she discovered something else. Among the boxes of dishes and bedding was a small, unlabeled package. Inside was an old leather-bound notebook. On the first page, in neat feminine handwriting, was written, "Emma Morgan's diary." Samantha opened the diary with trembling hands. The entries began a year before Emma's disappearance. March 15th. David was in a bad mood again today. He said, "I spend too much time at work, that a pastor's wife should think more about the home and the church. But I love my job. The children at school need me." March 22nd. He forbade me to see Eleanor, said she was a bad influence on me, filling my head with feminist ideas. But Eleanor is my best friend. How can I explain to her that I can't see her anymore? Samantha turned the pages, and the picture grew darker. May 10th. David hit me today. He said it was an accident, that he didn't mean to. He cried and begged for forgiveness. He promised it wouldn't happen again. I believe him. He's a good person. He's just tired of all the problems at church. May 15th. Another bruise on my arm. I tell everyone I fell. Eleanor looks at me suspiciously, but I can't tell her anything. David is a respected man in town. Who would believe me against him? Samantha's hands shook as she read the last entries. September 20th. I can't take this anymore. David is becoming increasingly violent. Yesterday he said that if I try to leave him, no one will ever see me again. I think he means it. Something has changed in his eyes. It's as if he no longer sees me as a human being. September 25th. I found photos of other women in his office. Newspaper clippings about missing girls. My God, what have I done marrying him? September 30th. Tomorrow I'll tell Eleanor everything. She'll help me get away. I have to disappear before he... The entry ended abruptly. It was the last page of the diary. Samantha slammed the book shut and felt the room start to spin. The lorazepam wasn't helping anymore. She took 3 pills, but the panic attack only got worse. "Miss Clark, are you okay?" asked the makeup artist. "Yes, I need to use the restroom." Samantha locked herself in the bathroom and took out her phone. She needed to talk to someone to tell about the diary. But who? Her father wouldn't believe her. Her friends would think she was having pre-wedding jitters. She remembered Detective Hayes. They said he was still investigating Emma's disappearance. Maybe he would believe her. But before she could dial the number, there was a knock at the door. "Sammy, it's Dad. David's here. He wants to see you. But it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding. He says it's important." Samantha quickly hid her diary in her makeup bag and left the bathroom. David was standing in the living room, looking as flawless and handsome as ever. But now, after reading Emma's diary, she saw him with different eyes. "Darling, you look pale," he said, approaching her. "Are you all right?" "Just nervous." David took her hands in his. His fingers were cold. "Sammy, I have something to tell you. About the past. About Emma." Samantha's heart began to beat faster. "What exactly?" "Our marriage wasn't perfect. By the end, Emma was very sick, mentally ill. She made things up, accused me of things I never did." "Like what?" "She said I beat her, that I threatened her. It was a symptom of her illness, but it was very painful for me. I tried to get her help, but she refused treatment." Samantha tried to free her hands, but David held on tighter. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because some people in town still believe her nonsense. If anyone tries to tell you bad things about me, please remember, she was a sick woman who couldn't control her words." "David, you're hurting me." He looked at his hands, still clenched around her wrists, and quickly let go. "I'm sorry, honey. I'm just very nervous. I don't want anything to ruin our day." After he left, Samantha felt even worse. David knew. Somehow he knew she had found out. But how? And what was he going to do about it? The time before the wedding flew by quickly. At 4 in the afternoon, guests began to gather at the church. Elko hadn't seen such a celebration in many years. People came from neighboring towns, journalists from the local newspaper, even a television crew from Reno. Detective Hayes was also among the guests, but not as an invitee, but as a police officer monitoring a potentially dangerous situation. The information received from his friend in Reno was becoming increasingly alarming. Lisa Parker from Carson City had disappeared under circumstances almost identical to Emma's. And in Phoenix, there was another woman, Maria Sanchez, who had been dating David and had suddenly gone to visit relatives, but her relatives had never seen her. Hayes had been trying to contact Samantha all day, but her phone was off. He even drove to the Clark's house, but security wouldn't let him pass the gate. Now he sat in the church, watching a tragedy unfold that he couldn't prevent. At 5 o'clock in the evening, the wedding march began to play. Samantha walked down the aisle in a luxurious white dress, but her face was pale as a ghost. David stood at the altar with a broad smile, but Hayes noticed that his eyes remained cold. The ceremony began. The pastor from the neighboring town read the traditional words about love, fidelity, and marriage for life. Samantha responded mechanically, as if in a trance. "If there are any reasons why these two should not be married, speak now or forever hold your peace," said the priest. Silence. 400 people held their breath, and then the impossible happened. The back doors of the church slowly opened. A woman appeared in the doorway, tall, slender, with long brown hair. She was wearing a dark blue dress, the very dress Samantha had found in the closet. The crowd froze. Someone screamed. Someone fainted. Emma Morgan was alive. She walked slowly down the aisle, and with each step, the church grew quieter. Finally, she stopped in front of the altar and looked straight at David. "Hello, dear," she said in a quiet but clear voice. "Did you miss me?" David's face turned white as a sheet. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. No sound. "I think I should tell these nice people the truth about what happened a year ago," Emma continued. She took a tape recorder out of her purse and pressed play. David's voice filled the church. "If you ever try to leave me, I'll kill you, and no one will ever find your body. Do you understand me, darling?" Then Emma's voice, "David, please don't." And the sound of a blow. Chaos erupted in the church. People screamed, pushed, and tried to get out. Samantha stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. David Morgan slowly reached into his jacket's inside pocket. Detective Hayes saw the movement and realized the pastor had a weapon. "Everyone on the floor!" he shouted, pulling out his gun. But it was too late. Time stood still in the New Hope Baptist Church. 400 guests froze in shock as they watched the woman who had been presumed dead for a year stand before the altar and accuse their beloved pastor of attempted murder. Emma Morgan looked like a ghost from the past, but there was a fire in her eyes that had never been there when she was with David. A year of secrecy had changed her. She stood tall, spoke with confidence, and was no longer the frightened woman who hid her bruises under makeup. "A year ago," she continued, addressing the stunned crowd, "this man tried to kill me. He beat me half to death and left me to die at South Fork Lake." David finally found his voice. "Emma, you're dead." "As you can see, I'm very much alive, dear." There was steel in her voice. "Although you tried very hard to fix it." Samantha stood next to the altar in her luxurious wedding dress, tears streaming down her face, smearing her carefully applied makeup. The diary she had read that morning had been true, every word. "I don't understand," she whispered. "David, explain." But David was no longer looking at his bride. All his attention was focused on Emma, and Detective Hayes recognized the look in his eyes as that of a cornered predator. "Dear parishioners," Emma said, taking a stack of photos out of her purse, "let me show you the true face of the man to whom you entrusted your souls." She began handing out the photos to the people sitting in the front rows. They were medical images, x-rays of broken ribs, photos of bruises, doctors' reports. People looked at them with horror and disbelief. "It's all fake!" David shouted. "She's mentally ill! I told everyone!" "Fake?" Emma took out another tape recorder. "Is this fake too?" A new recording filled the church. David's voice was calm, even gentle. "Do you know what happened to Lisa in Carson City? She wanted to leave me too. Now no one will ever find her. I'm very good at making people disappear forever." A wave of horror swept through the church. People began to rise from their seats and head for the exits. But Emma raised her hand. "Wait, I'm not finished. You need to know the truth about this man." She took out a folder of documents. "I've been gathering evidence for a year, bank records showing how he spent church money to bribe officials to cover up cases of missing women, copies of police reports from 3 different states, medical reports." William Clark rose from his seat in the front row. His face was red with anger. "Enough of this charade! David Morgan is a respected man. He has helped hundreds of families in our town." "Dad, no," Samantha said quietly. "She's telling the truth. I found the diary. He really did hit her." Clark turned to his daughter in shock. "Sammy, you don't understand what you're saying." "I do." Samantha pulled a notebook from the bouquet. "This is Emma's diary. It's all written here. Every blow, every threat." David saw the diary and something inside him snapped. The mask of the pious pastor fell away, revealing his true face. "Bitch!" he hissed, looking at Emma. "I should have made sure you were dead." He abruptly reached into his jacket pocket. Detective Hayes saw the glint of metal and realized David had a gun. "Weapon! Everyone on the floor!" Hayes shouted, drawing his service Glock. Panic broke out. People screamed, pushed, fell, trying to hide behind the benches or reach the exits. The camera continued to film, broadcasting the events live. David pointed the gun at Emma. "You ruined my life! I was happy! I had a new wife, a new future!" "You were happy beating defenseless women," Emma replied, not backing down. "But you won't hurt anyone else." "David, put the gun down!" Hayes shouted, aiming at the pastor. But it was difficult to shoot. There were still too many people around the altar. Dr. Eleanor Finch, who had been sitting quietly until then, suddenly stood up. "David Morgan!" Her voice cut through the chaos. "A year ago, I saved Emma from you. I found her dying by the lake after what you did to her." David turned to her, still holding the gun. "It was you?" "Yes, it was me. I forged the death certificate and helped her disappear. And you know what? I don't regret a thing." Eleanor took a step forward. "I've loved Emma since college. I watched her choose the wrong men for 30 years. But when I saw what you were doing to her, Eleanor, step back, Emma warned. But the doctor continued to approach David. You want to kill someone? Kill me. I'm the one who ruined your plan. I'd love to, David hissed and turned the gun toward Eleanor. At that moment, Samantha did something no one expected. She ripped the heavy tiara from her head and threw it at David. The ornament hit him in the temple and he staggered. Hayes took advantage of the moment of confusion and fired. The bullet hit David in the shoulder and he dropped the gun. But as he fell, he grabbed a candlestick from the altar and swung it at Samantha. If I can't have you, no one will, he shouted. Emma rushed forward, trying to protect the girl who was supposed to be her replacement. The heavy bronze candlestick came down on her head with a terrifying sound. Emma fell onto the marble steps of the altar. Blood began to spread across the white stone. No! Eleanor rushed to her, but it was too late. David tried to get up, but Hayes was already there. The second shot hit his leg, immobilizing the pastor. Call an ambulance, the detective shouted, leaning over Emma. Eleanor was already checking her pulse. Her hands were shaking. She's unconscious, severe concussion, possibly a skull fracture. Samantha stood over them, covered in Emma's blood, repeating, It's my fault. It's all my fault. No, dear, Emma whispered, regaining consciousness for a moment. It's not your fault. You're a victim, just like me. David lay on the floor in handcuffs, blood from the wound on his shoulder soaking his white shirt. He no longer looked like a charismatic pastor, just a defeated, embittered, middle-aged man. It's over, David, Hayes said. We have the recordings, the documents, the witnesses. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison. She ruined everything, David muttered, looking at Emma. I could have been happy with Samantha. I had a new life. You had a new victim, Hayes corrected him. The ambulance arrived 10 minutes later, but for those inside the church, it felt like an eternity. Eleanor stayed by Emma's side, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. Samantha sat on the steps, still in her wedding dress, now splattered with blood. William Clark stood aside, watching everything he believed in crumble. His brother-in-law had turned out to be a monster. His daughter was in shock, and his family's reputation was ruined forever. Reporters were filming everything. The story of the killer pastor, the resurrected victim, and the ruined wedding was already making headlines across the country. As Emma was loaded into the ambulance, she opened her eyes again and looked at Eleanor. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Don't say that like you're saying goodbye, Eleanor replied. You're strong. You survived a year ago, you'll survive now. And if I don't, then the whole world will know the truth about David Morgan, what he did to you and to other women. He'll never be considered a saint again. David was taken away in another ambulance under guard. As the stretcher passed the remaining guests, some spat in his direction. Others simply stared in horror at the man to whom they had entrusted their souls. Hayes helped Samantha to her feet. The girl was in shock, but physically unharmed. Do I need to give a statement? She asked. Later. Right now, you need to go home and rest. Home? She looked at the devastated church. I don't know where my home is now. Eleanor approached her. Stay with me until you can sort out your thoughts. But we don't even know each other. We're both victims of the same monster. That's closer than any acquaintance. Gradually, the church emptied. Only the police, gathering evidence, and church workers trying to wash the blood from the marble altar remained. Hayes stood in the doorway, looking at the place where, just an hour ago, a celebration was supposed to take place. But instead, tragedy had struck. Justice had prevailed, but at what cost? Emma Morgan had been preparing for this day for a year. She had gathered evidence and planned every detail of her return. She knew she was risking her life, but she couldn't let David marry another innocent girl. Now she was lying in the hospital between life and death, and David Morgan was in a cell awaiting trial for attempted murder, domestic violence, and probably murders in other states. The town of Elko had lost its charismatic pastor, but it had gained something more valuable, the truth, no matter how painful it was. The detective took out his phone and dialed his friend's number in Reno. Jack, it's Rob. The case is open. We're going to need exhumation warrants for Carson City and Phoenix. I think we're going to find a few more victims of our saintly pastor. The sun was setting over Elko, painting the sky a bloody red. It was the end of one of the darkest chapters in the town's history. But it was also the beginning of a long road to healing for everyone touched by David Morgan's lies. 3 weeks later, Elko resembled a town suffering from collective trauma. The main street, usually bustling with life, seemed deserted. Cafes and shops were operating at half capacity, and conversations on the streets were hushed. The story of the killer pastor had spread across the country, and Elko suddenly found itself at the center of unwanted media attention. Detective Robert Hayes sat in his office, poring over mountains of documents that had arrived from police stations across 3 states. The David Morgan case was growing by the day, turning into an investigation of a series of crimes spanning 20 years. The phone rang. It was the coroner from Carson City. "Detective Hayes, we have the results of the exhumation. The remains of Lisa Parker have been found in an old cemetery under a different name. Preliminary results show multiple bone fractures consistent with a beating." Hayes jotted the information down in his notebook. This was the 3rd confirmed victim. The remains of Maria Sanchez had been found in Phoenix, and yesterday the body of Jennifer Cole, a woman who had dated David 5 years ago and had supposedly moved to California, had been discovered in the desert near Elko. "How many more were there, you bastard?" the detective muttered, looking at David's photo in the file. At the city hospital, Dr. Eleanor Finch was conducting another examination of Emma Morgan. 3 weeks in a coma had left their mark. Emma had lost weight. Her face was gaunt, but her vital signs were slowly improving. "Her blood pressure has stabilized," Eleanor told the nurse. "The brain swelling is going down. There's hope." She didn't say it out loud, but she knew that even if Emma woke up, the effects of her injuries could be serious. Problems with memory, speech, motor functions. The woman who had spent a year preparing for her moment of justice could spend the rest of her life fighting her own body. The door to the room opened, and Samantha Clark entered. She had changed a lot in 3 weeks. She had lost weight, her hair had become dull, and there was a shadow in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "How is she?" Samantha asked quietly. "No change, but that's not bad. Every day that her condition is stable is a small victory." Samantha walked over to the bed and took Emma's lifeless hand in hers. "I've been reading her your diary," she said. "I think she should know that her story hasn't been wasted." Eleanor nodded. Samantha spent several hours every day at the hospital, reading Emma her own notes, telling her the latest news about the case, just talking. The psychologist said it helped her cope with the trauma herself. "Dr. Finch," Samantha turned to her, "what's going to happen to you? I heard the DA is considering charges of document tampering." Eleanor sighed. "I may lose my license. I may get probation. But you know what? I saved a life, and if I had to do it again, I would do the same thing." At that moment, David Morgan sat in a solitary cell in the county jail, awaiting trial. 2 surgeries saved his life, but his left arm was permanently partially paralyzed. The former pastor, who once charmed his congregation with his eloquence, now spent his days in silence, refusing to speak to his lawyers, psychologists, or journalists. He spoke only once in 3 weeks. When Detective Hayes came to report the discovery of a 3rd body, David raised his head and said, "Is Emma still alive?" "For now." "That's too bad. I should have finished the job back then at the lake." This confession was recorded on tape and became another nail in the coffin of his defense. David's court-appointed lawyer, Robert Mitchell, sat in his office studying a case he didn't want to take. There was so much evidence that any defense seemed hopeless. Audio recordings, medical records, witness statements, the bodies found. Everything pointed to his client's guilt. Mitchell could try to argue insanity, but a psychiatric evaluation had shown that David was fully aware of his actions. The only option left was a guilty plea in exchange for life imprisonment without parole, instead of the death penalty. A gloomy atmosphere reigned in the Clark mansion. William Clark spent the last 3 weeks trying to save the reputation of his family and the bank. Clients were withdrawing their deposits. Business partners were terminating contracts. The town blamed the Clark family for supporting a monster. "Dad, we need to leave Elko," Samantha said at dinner. "This is our home, Princess. We're not going to run away." Home? People spit at us on the street. Yesterday, someone smashed a window at the bank. This isn't home anymore." Clark put down his fork. At 62, he looked 80. His gray hair was thinning and his face was lined with deep wrinkles. "I knew," he said quietly. "What?" "I knew something was wrong with David. Emma came to me a few months before she disappeared. She asked me to help her leave her husband, said he was beating her." Samantha stared at her father. "And what did you do?" "Nothing. I told her it was a family matter, that she should work on her marriage. That divorce would damage David's reputation and the church." "My God, Dad." "I thought she was exaggerating. David was so important to the town's economy. His church attracted people, money, investment." Clark covered his face with his hands. "I put profit above human life." Samantha silently got up from the table and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" "To Emma, to tell her the truth when she wakes up. She has a right to know who else betrayed her." Meanwhile, at New Hope Church, an emergency church council meeting was underway. Only 12 of the usual 50 members were present. The rest had either left the community or were too ashamed to show their faces. The council chair, Margaret Wilson, a 70-year-old widow who had devoted 40 years of her life to the church, sat at the head of the table, her eyes red from crying. "We have to close the church," she said. "At least for a while. People won't come here anymore. This place is defiled." "But the church isn't a building," Deacon Thomas Brown objected. "It's a community. We can start over, somewhere else." "Who will believe us? We've been following a murderer for 20 years. We praised him, defended him, gave him money to kill people." The elderly woman was right. The New Hope community fell apart in 3 weeks. Of the 2,000 parishioners, less than 100 remained. The rest either moved to other churches or turned their backs on religion altogether. "What will happen to the children's shelter?" asked Treasurer Linda Harris. "We've been sponsoring it for 10 years. "The city will take over the funding," Brown replied, "at least until the end of the year." At that time, the news was reporting on the latest developments in the David Morgan case. A CNN reporter stood in front of the church and said, "The investigation has revealed that Reverend David Morgan may be responsible for the deaths of at least 5 women in 3 states. The FBI has expanded its investigation, looking into all the places where the accused has served over the past 20 years. In his prison cell, David heard these words on the guard's radio and smiled. 5 women. If only they knew the truth." The next day, the event everyone had been waiting for happened. Emma Morgan opened her eyes. Eleanor was there when it happened. She was checking the IV when she heard a soft moan. Turning around, she saw Emma looking at her. "Emma, can you hear me?" Emma's lips moved, but no sound came out. Eleanor leaned closer. "Don't try to talk. You're in the hospital. You're safe." Emma tried to nod, but even that movement was difficult. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "David?" she whispered finally. "In jail, waiting for trial. He won't hurt anyone else." Emma closed her eyes, and a look of relief spread across her face. Over the next few days, Emma's speech returned, although she spoke slowly and sometimes mixed up her words. Her memory was fragmented. She remembered her childhood, university, the first years of her marriage, but the events of the last year before her death were blurred. "I remember gathering evidence," she told Samantha and Eleanor, "but I don't remember how I planned to come back. It's like a dream." "It doesn't matter," Samantha said. "What matters is what you did. You saved me, and you stopped him." "But at what cost?" Emma looked at her hands, which were still shaking. "I feel broken." "We're all broken," Eleanor replied. "But broken things can be fixed. It just takes time." David Morgan's trial began 2 months after the events at the church. By that time, the FBI had found 3 more bodies in Arizona and Colorado. District Attorney James Parker decided to seek the death penalty. "This man is not just a murderer," he said at a press conference. "He is a predator who used religion as a cover for his crimes. He betrayed the trust of thousands of people and destroyed at least 8 lives." Mitchell made a last-ditch attempt to save his client by offering a plea bargain in exchange for life imprisonment, but the prosecution refused. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Emma testified via video link from the hospital. Doctors did not allow her to attend in person. Her speech was slow but confident. "He told me that if I tried to leave, no one would ever see me again," she testified. "Now I know that wasn't an empty threat." Samantha also testified. She talked about the diary, the dress she found, and how David tried to convince her that Emma was mentally ill. "He manipulated me from day one," she told the jury. "He used my insecurity, my desire to be needed. If it weren't for Emma, I would have been his next victim." The most powerful witness was Dr. Finch. Her medical examination of the recovered records showed systematic abuse of Emma over a period of 3 years. "The nature of the injuries leaves no doubt," she explained. "These were not accidental falls or domestic injuries. This was deliberate, brutal beatings." When it was David's turn, he refused to testify. He sat silently in the courtroom, staring into space as if what was happening did not concern him. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Death penalty. When the judge read the sentence, David finally showed emotion. He turned to the gallery where Emma, Samantha, and Eleanor were sitting and hissed, "This isn't the end. Even when I'm gone, you'll remember me for the rest of your lives. I'll be in your nightmares forever." The guards led him away, and the women embraced each other, crying with relief and grief at the same time. A year later, Elko slowly began to heal. The New Hope Church building was sold and converted into a community center. The Clark family moved to California, where William quietly retired. The bank was sold to a national chain. Emma recovered slowly, but steadily. Her speech returned almost completely, although her left arm remained partially paralyzed. She moved in with Eleanor, and their friendship gradually grew into something more. "I never thought I'd be able to trust anyone again," Emma said one evening as they sat on Eleanor's porch watching the sunset. "And I never thought anyone could love me for who I am," Eleanor replied. Samantha went to college on the East Coast to study psychology. She wanted to help victims of domestic violence. In her letters to Emma, she wrote, "I understand now that what happened to us was meant to happen, not because we deserved it, but because it was the only way to stop him. How many other women have we saved without even knowing their names?" Detective Hayes was promoted and became head of the state's serial crimes unit. The Morgan case changed his life. He quit drinking and began to believe in justice again. David Morgan was executed 4 years after his trial. He never expressed remorse or named all of his victims. The FBI estimates that there may have been as many as 15. On the day of the execution, Emma, Eleanor, and Samantha met in Elko at a memorial to victims of domestic violence, which had been erected on the site of a former church. The names of David's 8 confirmed victims were engraved on the black granite, along with the words, "They are not forgotten. Their voices are heard." "Is this really the end?" Samantha asked. "No," Emma replied, laying flowers at the memorial. "This is the beginning of a life without fear, the beginning of truth, the beginning of healing." They stood in silence, 3 women brought together by tragedy, but who had found the strength to turn their pain into hope. The town of Elko would never be the same again, but perhaps it would be better, a place where truth mattered more than reputation, and women's safety mattered more than men's convenience. A bird flew overhead, and Emma thought it might be a sign, not from God, whom she no longer believed in after everything she had been through, but from life itself. A sign that even after the darkest days, there is always a chance to fly. David Morgan's story was over, but Emma, Eleanor, and Samantha's stories were just beginning, and they were stories of survival, strength, and hope.